From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I am very excited to be able to introduce one of my children's and my favorite illustrators, Sophie Blackall, who I love. There's so many books of hers that I love that I didn't know which ones to start with, but certainly the Ivy and Bean series, the Big Red Lollipop, Ruby's Wish, and most recently Finding Winnie, which I won the 2016 Caldecott Medal. It's a wonderful story. I can't believe we're just learning now about the true story of the real bear that became Winnie the Pooh. In addition to her books, Sophie's art has appeared in numerous publications, and as part of the Measles and Rubella Initiative, an international effort to eliminate those two diseases. Anyway, I'm now here to tell you more about herself is Sophie Blackall.
Thank you very, very much. Before I even get started, I have a magic microphone, so I don't even have to stand there, which is very exciting, and I'm going to try not to fall off on top of you. I'm very excited to be here, and before I get started, I just want to thank all of the thousands of volunteers who have been here today doing things like helping me and bringing me water and helping everybody. It's been an extraordinary effort. Somebody told me there were 100,000 people here today, which is mind-boggling. So my name is Sophie Blackall, and I'm going to tell you mostly about Finding Winnie today. I grew up in Australia, which looks like this. So you can all understand, obviously, why I left it to live in New York, which looks like this. Not yet, but it will soon enough. I was once a child. It's hard to believe. I look pretty much the same, except younger. And when I was about 7, my mother worked in an antique shop. And every afternoon after school, I had to go and hang out in this antique shop. And I don't know about you, but when I was 7, I was not that interested in antiques, especially furniture. I thought it was really boring. So I had to spend all this time in this shop, and I was so bored in the antique shop that I had to pick up the only book that was in there. And it was a very dusty looking book. And I picked it up and I started reading it. And you know what? It was fantastic. It was this book. I still have it. It was Winnie the Pooh. And I had never read a book like this. It was a book that meandered and backtracked, that had digressions and interjections that kind of pulled you into the very forest itself, and also at the same time kind of let you step back and see what a book is actually made of. And I fell in love with the characters in it, and I never wanted to leave them behind, and I kind of didn't, because it is still my favorite book. When I grew a little bit older, and I didn't have to go to the antique shop anymore, I was allowed to walk home on my own, and I would walk the long way home past the butcher's shop. And I wasn't buying meat, you know, I was 7 or 8, but the butcher, I would get to the doorway and I would open the door, and he would see me, and he would roll up 3 sheets of butcher's paper, which is big white sheets of paper that he used to wrap sausages up in. And he would roll that paper up for me to draw on. And he would also give me a piece of bologna. And in my memory, he kind of threw it to me, and I caught it in my mouth, but I think I'm confusing myself with my dog. Anyway, I took the paper home and ate the bologna on the way, and I would draw, and I would trace my favorite drawings, which were Ernest Shepard's drawings in Winnie the Pooh. And I thought, maybe one day I might do this. Maybe one day I might make pictures in books. So I didn't do that for a while, but I went to art school and I did paintings of butchers because I have always loved butchers. And then to make money, because it's really boring as a grown-up, but you kind of have to make money, I did paintings of things like stain removal and household tips for a magazine. It was a high point in my career. Around this time I had a baby, and then another baby. And then I came to live in New York when I won a green card in the lottery. I've been here for 16 years, and sometimes I inadvertently dress as your flag because I love it so. And in those 16 years, I've made about 35 books, I think, And here are some of them that you might have seen. And around 2013, I received a manuscript from the editor, Susan Rich, at Little Brown. And Susan Rich sends all her manuscripts like this. And it was the story of the true bear, the true story of the real bear that inspired Winnie the Pooh. And I talked to Susan. We had an amazing breakfast with a lot of pancakes. And we talked about Winnie the Pooh and how it had been my first book that I bought with my own money, because I think we all remember the first book that we bought with our own money. Not the one that was given to us, not the one that we chose ourselves from the library but had to give back, but the first one that we bought with our own money and got to keep. And I bought this copy from my mother. She sold it to me. She didn't give it to me, she sold it to me. And I was 7, and I didn't have any money because 7-year-olds are, not usually rich. But it cost $1. And I polished the steps up to the antique shop, 10 cents a step, until I earned it. And I was so worried the whole time that somebody else would buy it. And so I'd hide it in the shop while I was polishing the steps. But so I have this book, and it means so much to me, this first book that I bought and the drawings. So Susan and I talked about all of this, and then I started work on this book, and it was such a joy. The book, Finding Winnie, is about Captain Harry Colborne, and it's written by his real-life great-granddaughter, Lindsay Mattick. And it's written as a story that she's telling to her son, Cole, who's a little boy, about 3 at the time. And the story is about Harry, who in the beginning of World War I was a veterinarian. He looked after horses and cows, and he joined the army to go and fight in the war. And he was going to be in the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and he was going to take care of horses on the front. And he joined many other young men, and they went to train in Valcartier in Canada. And on the train, on the way there, they stopped at a station, and Harry got out to stretch his legs because they'd been on the train for days. And on the station there in White River, he saw an orphaned black bear cub that was sitting there with a trapper. And he said to that trapper, "I'll give you $20 for that bear cub." $20 was all the money he had, which was about $300 in our money, and he just took it out of his pocket and he gave it to this trapper. And then he had a bear cub. And what was he going to do with a bear cub? He was going to war. But he took this bear, and he knew there was something special about this bear. And he thought, what will we call her? We all came from Winnipeg. All the soldiers that were together came from Winnipeg. So they decided to call her Winnipeg, Winnie for short, so they would never feel far from home. So they went to train on the green fields of Valcartier, and that's the hospital where he was looking after the horses. And so many other young men trained with them, and they were keen and excited to get to war, at least I imagine they were, and they had no idea what was to come. Harry and Winnie were inseparable by this point, and when it came time to sail across the Atlantic to England, Harry had to make a difficult decision. His head argued one way, but his heart argued the other, and he took Winnie with him on what was probably the greatest armada, the greatest passage of ships and horses and men ever to cross the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know if you can see Winnie up there on the bow. When they arrived in the Salisbury Plain, it rained and rained and rained, and the men posed for photographs with Winnie so they could send them back to their families. And then the order came to fight in France in the trenches, and Harry knew he couldn't take a bear really to war, so he had, for the second time, a difficult decision to make. And he borrowed a car and he drove Winnie to the London Zoo, and he said goodbye to her there, knowing that she would be safe. And she was safe, and she charmed everyone who met her, most notably a small boy called Christopher Robin, whose father was A.A. Milne. And A.A. Milne would go on to write stories about Boy and Bear that are some of the most beloved books of all time. When I set about making a book I read the story and I think about how the pictures are going to go and how they're going to fit with the words, and I make a kind of map of those drawings, and then I make each drawing a little bit bigger and a little bit neater. And around this time I show them to my editor Susan and the art director, and we talk about them and they tell me everything that's wrong with them, and I try and fix all those things, and then I make a neater, bigger drawing, and then eventually I paint that once we've all decided it's probably going in more or less the right direction. And you can see little differences, like Winnie was, before she was on the bench, and then she moved to be behind the bench. So there are still some little changes to be made at that point. Here's another pencil sketch, and here it is in color. With a book like Finding Winnie, which is a true story, it's nonfiction, there's a lot of research involved, which is fortunately one of my favorite parts of making a book. This is Captain Harry Colborne's real diary that he kept during the war, and it's noted there on August 24th that he bought a bear for $20. Because the author is Lindsay Mattick, she had all of her family artifacts and ephemera that I could actually touch and look at, which was an amazing experience and made my job a whole lot easier. Photographs of Harry and Winnie. This drawing was based on this real photograph. You can see Winnie up there in the front. I went looking for bears, as you do, out in the woods, and I called them, and you know, they never came, which was very disappointing. And I not very wisely think that bears would like me. I have no foundation for this, but they still have not come. So I looked at photographs of bears, and I flew to London and went to the London Zoo and the archives in the London Zoo, which is like a library in the zoo, and the librarian showed me a great big book called The Daily Occurrences, in which the zookeeper would write everything that happened that day in the zoo. Everything from when an animal got sick to a new animal was born, or one arrived or departed. And this is the day, he brought it out of a big box to show me the very day that Winnie arrived at the London Zoo. I looked at pictures of the brand new Mappin Terraces, which was just built when Winnie was put there. It was where the bears lived. And I looked at the zoo now, at the Mappin Terraces, and oddly enough, it's where they keep the Australian marsupials. So I was able to visit my countrymen, the wallabies and kangaroos. This photograph, which I had seen again and again in my research, of Christopher Robin feeding Winnie condensed milk on a spoon. The original photograph was there in the archives, and when you saw the whole photograph, you could see a little blurry up the top, A.A. Milne and Nanny looking down into the enclosure. And it just struck me, it actually strikes me every single time I look at this photograph, just how odd it is to allow your child into an enclosure with a wild bear. But Winnie was no ordinary bear, as we know. I wanted to show the day that Winnie is left at the zoo. I wanted to show just that parting and how profoundly full of sorrow it was. So I wanted to show her tiny in this vast zoo, and I had an idea to make it like an aerial photograph. And this was the map which was closest in time period. We were talking 1914, and this map was 1913. But I wanted it to look like this much earlier map, which was more of a bird's eye view. So I had to research every single building to see, because they had all moved, to see what they looked like in 3D so that I could draw them in the correct space of the 1913 map, which was, you know, I've already lost you, I'm sure. It was weeks and weeks of dead ends and backtracking. But, you know, that's what I live for. It was fantastic fun. And I put all sorts of little secrets in there. Like in 1913, they thought it was a great idea to try and make the enclosures a little bit more like natural habitats. So they put the seals and the penguins in together because, you know, they coexist in real life. So that makes sense, except, of course, that the penguins were extremely delicious and that their numbers diminished day by day. So I've just left one unsavory penguin in the enclosure with the seals. I went to the War Museum in London and read soldiers' diaries and looked at maps where they would have walked and learned that the Canadian soldiers had boots with cardboard soles that disintegrated in the mud. And these details never went into the book, but I know that they're there, and it helped me to really feel the story and how Winnie and Harry and all of the soldiers might have felt in these conditions. Looking at the maps, I realized that when Harry and Winnie went to London from the Salisbury Plain, they passed Stonehenge. So I had the perfect excuse to put Stonehenge in, except of course I had to find photographs of what Stonehenge looked like in 1914 from the very direction that I was going, which is not as easy as it sounds, because people care about these things. A lot of people know a lot about Stonehenge. The crossing of the ships, another thing that people know a lot about. This is the only visual reference that exists, and it's a lovely patriotic painting called Canada's Answer. But it didn't give me a whole lot of help of what each ship looked like. And I had a list of the formation that they sailed in, and I knew what Winnie and Harry's ship looked like, which was the SS Manitou. So I did a sketch, and then I looked at the list, which was on the military archives, and it was sort of like a game of battleships. I had to kind of figure out by process of elimination which ones I couldn't find, which ones I could, how to show them in the right order. And when I was thinking about battleships, I found this game that I loved as a kid, but clearly girls and their mothers are not allowed to play battleships. Their job is to enjoy from afar as they do the washing up, as the sons and fathers have a rousing game. Back in the old days. In the 11th hour, somebody saved my skin by noticing a terrible flaw, a possibly fatal flaw in this painting. Can anybody see what it is? It's 1914. We are crossing the Atlantic. The Canadian flag, thank you. The Canadian flag, the beloved maple leaf, was designed, I think, in 1969, 67, something like that, not in 1914. So thankfully, a Canadian person in the post-production department, the book was about to be printed, it was all there. He said, wait a minute. So thank goodness it was changed. The book would have been a disaster otherwise. I wanted very much to show the context of the war, even though this book doesn't really deal with the actual war itself. It skirts around it, but I wanted to show something of what was happening at this time. And so I bookended Harry's departure to war with the sort of iconic image of families parting, with his arrival home. And if you look closely, and children always notice these details, it's the same families, and we see some of them haven't returned at all, and some of them have returned with a limb missing, or otherwise kind of showing the devastation that was the Great War. I painted end papers, which was one of the many joys of working with Little Brown, where they sort of said yes to everything, and hid all of the animals in the woods, in the idea that we're finding Winnie. And around this time, Lindsay, the author, was organizing an exhibition in London for the centenary of World War I, and she said, Prince Charles is opening the exhibition, and I wondered if you could do a painting for Prince George. I'm leaving tomorrow, but if you do it really quickly and send it, we could give it to him. And so we did, and she actually handed it to Prince Charles, and this was the painting. And I feel now that I can win any game of 6 degrees of separation, because I have met someone who has met Prince Charles, and he's met everybody. So, the very last thing I did on the book was a special treat, partly because I didn't want work on the book to end. I had seen this photograph in my research of soldiers over the trenches, and it reminded me of something. And I couldn't quite shake what that thing was until I remembered that it was the end papers of my edition of Winnie the Pooh. And so I combined them two in my nod to my beloved Ernest Shepard. And that's the case cover, that's the secret inside the jacket. When you make a book, there's a very strange lull when it goes off to the printer, and it has a long gestation when you've done it, but it's not out yet. And I took to carrying the printed proofs around with me like an expectant parent carries a sonogram. And around this time, I did a school visit. And I did the usual things I do in a school visit. I painted with Chinese ink upside down, and I told the kids stories about the terrible dog that lived next door that ate all the artwork from Ivy and Bean when it was sent back. The dog literally ate my homework. I told them about travels I had done recently with UNICEF and Save the Children to schools in Congo and India and Bhutan, which is a country where the mountains meet the sky and monasteries are built into the sides of rocks and there are unicorns and children dress like silk butterflies when they go to school, and every morning they sit in the classroom for a minute with their eyes closed and they think in silence about what they learned the day before and what they're going to learn the next day, and it's the most beautiful way I have ever seen a school day beginning. And I showed them a classroom in Rwanda, and this is what it looks like when it's empty, and then I showed them what it looks like when it's full, and there are 80 kids can fit into a classroom, and there aren't desks or paper much or books, but how there's a program with Save the Children where they're bringing books by local authors and artists into these classrooms. And I showed them a picture of children opening the very first book they had ever held in their hands, and these are those children, and they're making out the words, and they're reading the story, and they're seeing the pictures, and it was so wonderful to be part of that. And I told the kids all of these things, and how we drew together on paper, and how the world over it seems that girls will draw girls, and boys will draw cars. And how they drew until every inch of that paper was full. And then I said, are there any questions? And a girl said, yes, yes, yes. And I said, what is it? She said, can you read us a story? And I said, after all that, you want a story? And she said, yes. And they all said yes. And so I pulled the proofs of Finding Winnie out of my bag and I read it to them. And it was so wonderful. And the teachers were all crying, and the kids weren't crying. But we got to this bit where Harry leaves Winnie at the zoo, and Cole says, is that the end? And we learn that sometimes you have to let one story end for another to begin. And Cole says, how do you know when that will happen? And his mother says, you don't, which is why you should always carry on. And I think then you turn the page and you see Christopher Robin and his bear, and this new story begins. And I think this idea of letting one story end so another can begin is quite profound. I think it's how, as human beings, we deal with change, whether it's grief from the loss of a loved one, whether it's moving house or changing schools or simply growing up. But we tell these stories to each other, and we are part of each other's stories as they are part of ours, and we pass those stories down from generation to generation. And the wonderful thing about a book is that you can go back to those stories, and those books are your friends, and they are there whenever you want them, and you have only to open the cover. Thank you very much. Do we have a few minutes for questions? We do. Are there any questions? Do you have a question for me, young man? Yes, fantastic. Don't make it too hard. Nothing about dinosaurs.
Fine.
Okay, go.
What caught you about the first book that you bought, the Winnie the Pooh book, that made you so happy and so wanting to make like the history about it?
That's such a great question. Well, I was little at the time, and it was the first book that I read that kind of told a story, but also talked to me at the same time. It was sort of, the writer stops telling the story and then sort of says, you know, this is happening right now, and he kind of chats to you like he's really talking to you when you read it, and it's funny, and it's the first book I read as a kid that made me feel grown up, even though I was only 7, you know, and I loved the characters so much. Have you ever read it, Winnie the Pooh? You have? Do you like it? Ah, we're friends, you and I. Anyone who likes Winnie the Pooh. Oh, over here, I'm sorry. I'm blinded by this light. Tell me, hello.
How long have you been writing?
Well, I've been writing for a long time, but most of the books, I've written maybe 3 or 4 books, and all of the other ones I've done, other people have written. So, and I draw the pictures for those. And both ways are fun, because do you know the Ivy and Bean books?
I've seen them, but I've never read them.
Oh, you should absolutely read them. They're really funny, and they're written by Annie Barrows, who is amazing. She is just so funny and great and clever, and these books are really good. And so it's so much fun working with an author who has great ideas and great stories. It's really fun. I recommend them. Yes?
You did a good job on the book.
Thank you.
How you make books?
How do you make books? You start with an idea, and then you tell a story, and then if you want to make pictures to go with it, you make those pictures, and then usually you have to send them to someone like an editor who is kind of like a teacher who tells you if you need to do some revising, and then it gets sent off to a printer, and then it comes back in boxes, and they go off to bookshops and libraries, and then you have a real book. It's easy. See? Just easy. You could do it. You could totally do it. Oh, over here.
I've always loved the Ivy and Bean books, and I always love your drawings, and I can totally visualize what's going on with your drawings.
That's great. Do you have a secret burning question about Ivy and Bean? I'll make it up if I don't know the answer.
How do you visualize?
Well, that's part of where Annie's so fantastic, because you know when you're reading Ivy and Bean, they're real. Annie and I sometimes believe they're real. Sometimes I feel like I'm not even drawing Ivy and Bean, that they just exist, and I'm just drawing these people who are real and are actually doing these things, because her writing is so, like, the voices are so real. They're like real kids, aren't they? I think so. Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
How do you feel when you get commented on your mistakes on your book?
Oh, that's a really good question. Has that ever happened to you?
No.
No? Well, you're lucky. You know what? Sometimes when I first get that comment, I think that you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. And then I don't say that out loud, but that's what the voice in my head is saying. And then I think, maybe there's something in what you're saying, and then often the other person is right, which is why it's so great to work on something with someone else who you really trust and really love, and their ideas are great too, and sometimes you're right and sometimes they're right, and you make this thing that's better because you make it together. So a thick skin I think is the answer. 2 minutes left. Maybe we have over here.
When you were little,
yeah,
have you always been good at writing and drawing?
You know what? No, I was terrible at drawing, but I loved doing it so much that I kept doing it even though I was really bad. And I promise I'm not just saying that because my mother kept my drawings and I can see them, and they're terrible. You know, I would try and draw an animal. Have you ever had that experience where you're trying to draw something in your head and you can see it so clearly and it's amazing, right? It's an amazing, beautiful drawing. And then you start putting it on the page and that's not what I can see in my head. And it's so unfair. It's just rotten. But if you keep doing it and keep doing it, it eventually gets to something else. And it may not ever look as good as it does in your head, but sometimes you kind of embrace those. I talk about embracing my limitations. I'm really bad at drawing things how they actually look, but I draw things in my own weird way, and now I'm okay with that. And I love doing it, and it's partly how much you love doing it, I think. That's a very nice question, thank you. Yes?
How long did it take you to write this book?
Well, I did not write it, so it took me no time at all. It was the easiest book I ever wrote. It was written by Lindsay Mattick, who was Harry's real-life great-granddaughter. So the story came to me already written. But sometimes when I write a book, it's much quicker than when I do the pictures. Sometimes I have an idea, and sometimes I write it really quickly, like maybe in a few hours. But then, usually, I spend months kind of changing a word here and a sentence there, and then rewriting the whole thing. But drawing usually takes me about a whole year, so.
So, yeah, it takes you about a year to draw, and like
just a few hours to write, which is why, you know, authors, their job's really easy, and illustrators have the hard job, yeah.
My mom's an author, so.
Yeah, right? Right? So you probably see that at home. She probably just lies around eating cupcakes and just like writing a little book now and then. It's no trouble at all. Wrapped up over a lot of time. Thank you all so much, especially fantastic questions from you guys. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.